So I encountered these ideas, I would say, first reading a book back in 1982 by a man named Jeffrey Gray, who was influenced by Norbert Wiener and by general cybernetic theory. And he regarded the hippocampus as, at least as part of the central part of the brain involved in contrasting expectation, let's say, the way you expect the world to lay itself out, with the way the world is actually laying itself out, indicating that surprise was what was the prodroma to anxiety, and that anxiety in some sense was an indicator of the magnitude of mismatch between expectation and reality. So I want to ask you a couple of questions about that, because I thought a lot about Gray, and I thought about Gray for like 40 years after reading his book, and also as a consequence of encountering your ideas much later. The cybernetic model of expectation is predicated on the idea that you lay out an expectation on the world, and the expectation is a model, and then you have incoming sensory data, and the sensory data is the world, and that now and then there's a mismatch between the sensory data and the expectation. And then you have to modify either the representation or the action pattern to reduce that mismatch. But then I thought, well, wait a second, there's a weird lack in that formulation. It's twofold. Number one, it isn't obvious to me that it's expectation. It seems to me that it's more likely to be desire. And that's a useful transformation of conceptualization, because if you use the word desire rather than the word expectation, you can infer that the models that are being contrasted against the real world are models of motivation rather than cold cognitive computation. And so, for example, if I'm interacting with a woman who I'm romantically interested in, I'm attempting to bring about the realization of my desire, not my expectation. And that's under the pressure, let's say, of the demand for sexual reproduction. And so the motivational state grips the desire. The desire manifests itself as a fantasy, and then the motivation is the minimization of the discrepancy between the actual world and the fantasy. And then, so it's not exactly an expectation because it's more dynamic and alive. And then one more, I hate to hammer you with all of this right at the beginning, but one more issue on that front is the error. Because you could imagine, and I'm interested in how this matches your hierarchical concept. If I make a mistake such that I don't minimize the relationship between what's happening and my fantasy, one of the mistakes I might make is a mistake of perception, not expectation or desire, because I might be seeing the situation wrong. And so it seems to me that it's more realistic to say that what you're doing is minimizing the mismatch between a model of what's happening, not sensory data itself, but a model of the unfolding present, contrasted with a fantasy, and that the mismatch is what indicates surprise or entropy. I know that's a lot of questions to answer at the same time, but that whole set of objections makes up a pattern. I think people hem themselves in their actions even. And once people, you see this clinically, is once people develop a conceptualization of themselves, which is a box in some sense to put their variability in, they'll sometimes simplify themselves in terms of their range of action merely so they don't surprise themselves. And so they artificially constrain the range of their potential behavior, and that can become maladaptive if their conception of themselves is too narrow. That would be a good example of in some sense, of a misperception of the self, right? It's a narrowing of possibility. And so I should maybe try to explain to people a little bit more about this issue of entropy. And there's this notion that's come out of theory of perception that any set of objects, or any object for that matter, is different from any other object and the same as any other object in a multitude or even a near infinite number of ways. And so you could I always think of two goblets standing on a table, and you might say, well, they're identical, but they're not. And you can tell they're not if you wanted to paint them in a photorealistic manner. You'd find that the surface of one goblet is very much unlike the surface of another, and you'd have to render that at high resolution in order to represent it accurately on a canvas. And then they differ in weight, and they differ in the regularity of the surface, and they might differ in age. There's all sorts of differences between them that you might not think are germane or relevant, but that's really the issue, is why do you regard some similarities as crucial and some differences as irrelevant? And so here's something I'd like to run by you. So would it be reasonable to say, imagine a hierarchy of perception and conception. So the idea is, well, two goblets are identical if I can drink out of either of them using the same pattern of perception and action. So that's kind of an indication of the entropy constrained by the notion of wishing to drink. Any two things are substitutable as long as they leave me with the ability to drink as an axiom of my current action set. That's something like maybe a computational definition of resemblance. Because I can't understand how you can bind resemblance otherwise if any two things differ in a near infinite number of ways. They differ in terms of the microstates that they might be composed of. That would be a way of thinking about it from the perspective of entropy theory. So if they're substitutable within a higher hierarchical conception, then they're identical perceptually and conceptually. So do you know the change blindness experiments that was Dan Simon managed at Harvard? Yeah, well, that's a good example, right? So I'll just run through one of those experiments for the people listening. So imagine you put a camera on a two-story building and it's looking down over a university yard. And now imagine that you have tourists walking through the yard, and an undergraduate research associate comes up to a tourist with a map and asks the tourist to help him find his way. And while that's happening, some other experimental compatriots walk between the person who's asking for directions and the tourist carrying a door, two of them. And the person asking the question grabs the door hidden from the tourist and continues walking with the door. And the person who is carrying the door stands there and continues asking the question with the map. And what Simon found was that the largest percentage of people, the majority of people, do not notice that the student has been swapped in the middle of the conversation. And the reason for that has to be that the perception of the student by the tourist is something like generic student asking for directions, and any student who's asking for directions at that point will fulfill that function or act as a player in that story, and so there's no reason to be surprised by the transformation, even though, quote, it's a different person. And that seems to add credence to this notion of a theory of identity or resemblance. Does that seem reasonable to you? Right, and so the optimal simple explanation is the least complex affordance necessary for the operation at hand. And so then we could talk about affordances a little bit. So people who are watching and listening might think that you see the object and infer the meaning. But the theory of affordances would suggest that you see the meaning and infer the object, or something like that. It reverses it. And that what you see first is something like functional utility. But I think you can bring both those positions together if you think that what we see in the world are patterns that have functional utility. Now, there's all sorts of patterns that don't have functional utility or that only have potential functional utility. You might consider patterns that don't have specified functional utility as something like the infinite domain of potential empirical facts. If a fact is something like the accurate identification of a pattern that exists stably across contexts. But then we can't see all the set of all possible facts because it's way too large. And so we want to reduce that further to that set of patterns that offer us a grip on the world. And Gibson, who wrote An Ecological Approach to Visual Perception, talked a lot about affordances, tools and obstacles in particular, if I remember correctly. But I'm wondering as well, is the domain of affordance, here's a way of conceptualizing the domain of affordance. It's tool, those things that you can get a grip on the world with and move forward towards a desired goal. Obstacles, so things that get in your way of different size. And then pathways. And the pathways so I would say the pathways are littered with tools and obstacles. And the description of a pathway that's littered with tools and obstacles, that's a story. It looks to me like those hierarchical conceptual boxes are best conceptualized as something like stories. If they're an amalgam of affordance and pattern, then they're not either just an object or just the subject. They're the bringing of the two together. And the story is where the pattern and the purpose meet. That's a way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
And I would think maybe even when you perceive a tool, it seems to me that what you're perceiving is something like a micro story. You know, like if I perceive this pen, say, well, that's obviously, it's an objective fact that this pen exists. And it is insofar as the pen is a stable pattern in time and space, but it's the function of the pen that makes it a pen and gives the unity that it gives a unity to the perception, because you might ask, well, why is the pen a pen this way and a pen this way and also a pen this way? Well, because its objective characteristics transform tremendously when it's moved or when it's illuminated differently, but its function remains constant. And so I think even an affordance is a micro story. So a tool is a positive, it's a comedy. That's a way of thinking about it. A tool is a comedy and an obstacle is a tragedy. And we lay out the world like that, even at the level of our fundamental perceptions. What do you think of the idea of a concept or a percept as a story? Because you see, the reason I like that, the reason I think this is so important is that there's an entire literature on narrative. Of course, the entire literature on literature is about narrative. If it is the case that our fundamental concepts are narrative in their origin and their nature, then that allows us to lay the narrative world on top of the objective world. And I think that's well, it would be lovely if that was a possibility. It would alleviate the terrible tension between them. Then, of course, the question comes up was what's the best narrative? But that's something we can also talk about in terms of hierarchical processing.